The world as will. It is a perennial philosophical reflection that if one looks deeply enough into oneself, one will discover not only one's own essence, but also the essence of the universe. For as one is a part of the universe, as is everything else, the basic energies of the universe flow through oneself as they flow through everything else. For that reason, it is thought that one can come into contact with the nature of the universe if one comes into substantial contact with one's ultimate inner being. Among the most frequently identified principles that are introspectively brought forth, and one that was the standard for German idealist philosophers such as Fichte, Schelling, and Hegel, who were philosophizing within the Cartesian tradition, is the principle of self-consciousness. With the belief that acts of self-consciousness exemplify a self-created process akin to divine creation, and developing a logic that reflects the structure of self-consciousness, namely the dialectical logic of position, opposition, and reconciliation, sometimes described as the logic of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, the German idealists maintain that dialectical logic mirrors the structure not only of human productions, both individual and social, but the structure of reality as a whole, conceived of as a thinking substance or conceptually structured and constituted being. As much as he opposes the traditional German idealists in their metaphysical elevation of self-consciousness, which he regards as too intellectualistic, Schopenhauer philosophizes within the spirit of this tradition, for he believes that the supreme principle of the universe is likewise apprehensible through introspection, and that we can understand the world as various manifestations of this general principle. For Schopenhauer, this is not the principle of self-consciousness and rationally infused will, but is rather what he simply calls will, a mindless, aimless, non-rational impulse at the foundation of our instinctual drives, and at the foundational being of everything. Schopenhauer's originality does not reside in his characterization of the world as will, or as act, for we encounter this position in Fichte's philosophy, but in the conception of will as being devoid of rationality or intellect. Having rejected the Kantian position that our sensations are caused by an unknowable object that exists independently of us, Schopenhauer notes importantly that our body, which is just one among the many objects of the world, is given to us in two different ways. We perceive our body as a physical object among other physical objects, subject to the natural laws that govern the movements of all physical objects, and we are aware of our body through our immediate awareness, as we each consciously inhabit our body, intentionally move it, and feel directly our pleasures, pains, and emotional states. We can objectively perceive our hand as an external object, as a surgeon might perceive it during a medical operation, and we can also be subjectively aware of our hand as something we inhabit, as something we move willfully, and of which we can feel its inner muscular workings. From this observation, Schopenhauer asserts that among all the objects in the universe, there is only one object, relative to each of us, namely our physical body, that is given in two entirely different ways. It is given as representation, i.e., objectively, externally, and as will, subjectively, internally. One of his notable conclusions is that when we move our hand, this is not to be comprehended as a motivational act that first happens and then causes the movement of our hand as an effect. He maintains that the movement of our hand is but a single act, again, like the two sides of a coin, that has a subjective feeling of willing as one of its aspects, and the movement of the hand as the other. More generally, he adds that the action of the body is nothing but the action of will objectified, that is, translated into perception. At this point in his argumentation, Schopenhauer has established only that among his many ideas, or representations, only one of them, viz., the complex representation of his body, has this special, double-aspected quality. When he perceives the moon or a mountain, he does not under ordinary circumstances have any direct access to the metaphysical inside of such objects. They remain as representations that reveal to him only their objective side. Schopenhauer asks, though, how he might understand the world as an integrated whole, or how he might render his entire field of perception the most comprehensible. For as things stand, he can directly experience the inside of one of his representations, but of no others. To answer this question, he uses the double knowledge of his own body as the key to the inner being of every other natural phenomenon. He regards, as if he were trying to make the notion of universal empathy theoretically possible, every object in the world as being metaphysically double-aspected, and as having an inside or inner aspect of its own, just as his consciousness is the inner aspect of his own body. This is his rationale for rejecting Descartes' causal interactionism, where a thinking substance is said to cause changes in an independent material substance, and vice versa. This precipitates a position that characterizes the inner aspect of things, as far as we can describe it, as will. Hence, Schopenhauer regards the world as a whole, as having two sides. The world is will, and the world is representation. The world as will, for us, as he sometimes qualifies it, is the world as it is in itself, which is a unity. And the world as representation is the world of appearances, of our ideas, or of objects, which is a diversity. An alternative title for Schopenhauer's main book, The World as Will and Representation, might well have been The World as Reality and Appearance. Similarly, his book might have been entitled The Inner and Outer Nature of Reality. An inspiration for Schopenhauer's view that ideas are like inert objects is George Berkeley, 1685 to 1753, who describes ideas in this deactivated way in his A Treatise Concerning the Principles of Human Knowledge, 1710. A primary inspiration for Schopenhauer's double-aspect view of the universe is Baruch de Spinoza, 1632 to 1677, who developed a similarly structured metaphysics, and who Schopenhauer had studied in his early years before writing his dissertation. A subsequent, but often highlighted inspiration is from the Upanishads, circa 900 to 600 BC, which also expresses a double-aspected view of the universe as having objective and subjective aspects, referred to respectively as Brahman and Atman. Only a few months after completing his dissertation, Schopenhauer was exposed to classical Indian thought in late 1813 by the Orientalist Friedrich Majer, 1771 to 1818, who visited Johanna Schopenhauer's salon in Weimar. Schopenhauer also probably met, at the time, Julius Klaproth, 1783 to 1835, who was the editor of Das Asiatische Magazin. As the records of his library book withdrawals indicate, Schopenhauer began reading the Bhagavad Gita in December 1813, or very soon thereafter, and the Upanishads in March 1814, coincident with the time when Schopenhauer's thought assumed an explicitly atheistic quality. Only a year before this, he was referring to himself explicitly in his notebooks as an illuminated theist, i.e., a mystic, in an 1812 discussion of Schelling's philosophy. Schopenhauer's appreciation for Indian thought was augmented in Dresden during the writing of The World as Will and Representation by his 1815 to 17 neighbor, Karl Friedrich Christian Krause. Not only was Krause a metaphysical pan-entheist, he was also an enthusiast of South Asian thought. Familiar with the Sanskrit language, he introduced Schopenhauer to publications on India in the Asiatische Magazin, and these enhanced Schopenhauer's studies of the first European language translation of the Upanishads. In 1801, a Persian version of the Upanishads, the Upnikhat, was rendered into Latin by the French Orientalist Abraham Hyacinthe Anquetil-Duperron, 1731 to 1805, a scholar who also introduced translations of Zoroastrian texts into Europe in 1771. Despite its general precedence within the philosophical family of double-aspect theories, Schopenhauer's particular characterization of the world as will is nonetheless novel and daring. It is also frightening and pandemonic. He maintains that the world, as it is in itself, again sometimes adding for us, is an endless striving and blind impulse with no end in view, devoid of knowledge, lawless, absolutely free, entirely self-determining, and almighty. Within Schopenhauer's vision of the world as will, there is no God to be comprehended, and the world is conceived of as being inherently meaningless. When anthropomorphically considered, the world is represented as being in a condition of eternal frustration, as it endlessly strives for nothing in particular, and as it goes essentially nowhere. It is a world beyond any ascriptions of good and evil. Schopenhauer's denial of meaning to the world differs radically from the views of Fichte, Schelling, and Hegel, all of whom sustained a distinct belief that everything is moving towards a harmonious and just end. Like these German idealists, however, Schopenhauer explained how the world that we experience daily is the result of the activity of the central principle of things. Just as the German idealists accounted for the great chain of being, the rocks, trees, animals, and human beings, as the increasingly complicated and detailed objectifications of self-consciousness, Schopenhauer explained the world as objectifications of will. For Schopenhauer, the world we experience is constituted by objectifications of will that correspond first to the general root of the principle of sufficient reason, and second to the more specific fourfold root of the principle of sufficient reason. This generates a two-tiered outlook, viz. Will equals reality versus objects in general equals appearance, that articulates into a three-tiered outlook, viz. Will equals reality versus universal non-spatio-temporal objects versus individual spatio-temporal objects, by further distinguishing between universalistic and individualistic levels within the sphere of objects. The general philosophical pattern of a single world essence that initially manifests itself as a multiplicity of abstract essences that, in turn, manifest themselves as a multiplicity of physical individuals is found throughout the world. It is characteristic of Neoplatonism, circa 3rd century CE, as represented by Plotinus, as well as the Buddhist three-body doctrine, Trikaya, of the Buddha's manifestation, that is developed in the Yogacara school of Mahayana Buddhism, as represented by Maitreya, 270-350, Asanga, 375-430, and Vasubandhu, 400-480. According to Schopenhauer, corresponding to the level of the universal subject-object distinction, will is immediately objectified into a set of universal objects, or Platonic ideas. These constitute the timeless patterns for each of the individual things that we experience in space and time. There are different Platonic ideas, and although this multiplicity of ideas implies that some measure of individuation is present within this realm, each idea nonetheless contains no plurality within itself and is said to be one. Since the Platonic ideas are in neither space nor time, they lack the qualities of individuation that would follow from the introduction of spatial and temporal qualifications. In these respects, the Platonic ideas are independent of the specific fourfold root of the principle of sufficient reason, even though it would be misleading to say that there is no individuation whatsoever at this universal level, for there are many different Platonic ideas. Schopenhauer refers to the Platonic ideas as the direct objectifications of will and as the immediate objectivity of will. Will's indirect objectifications appear when our minds continue to apply the principle of sufficient reason beyond its general root, such as to introduce the forms of time, space, and causality, not to mention logic, mathematics, geometry, and moral reasoning. When will is objectified at this level of determination, the world of everyday life emerges, whose objects are, in effect, kaleidoscopically multiplied manifestations of the Platonic forms, endlessly dispersed throughout space and time. Since the principle of sufficient reason is, given Schopenhauer's inspiration from Kant, the epistemological form of the human mind, the spatio-temporal world is the world of our own reflection. To that extent, Schopenhauer says that life is like a dream. As a condition of our knowledge, Schopenhauer believes that the laws of nature, along with the sets of objects that we experience, we ourselves create in a way that is not unlike the way the constitution of our tongues invokes the taste of sugar. As Galileo Galilei, 1564-1642, states in The Assayer, 1623, if ears, tongues, and noses were removed from the world, then odors, tastes, and sounds would be removed as well. At this point, what Schopenhauer has developed philosophically is surely interesting, but we have not yet mentioned its more remarkable and memorable aspect. If we combine his claim that the world is will, with his Kantian view that we are responsible for the individuated world of appearances, we arrive at a novel outlook, an outlook that depends heavily upon Schopenhauer's characterization of the thing in itself as will, understood to be an aimless, blind striving. Before the human being comes onto the scene with its principle of sufficient reason, or principle of individuation, there are no individuals. It is the human being that, in its very effort to know anything, objectifies an appearance for itself that involves the fragmentation of will and its breakup into a comprehensible set of individuals. The result of this fragmentation, given the nature of will, is terrible. It is a world of constant struggle, where each individual thing strives against every other individual thing. The result is a permanent war of all against all, akin to what Thomas Hobbes, 1588 to 1679, characterized as the state of nature. Kant maintains in the Critique of Pure Reason that we create the laws of nature. Adding to this, Schopenhauer maintains, in The World as Will and Representation, that we create the violent state of nature, for his view is that the individuation we impose upon things is imposed upon a blind striving energy that, once it becomes individuated and objectified, turns against itself, consumes itself, and does violence to itself. His paradigm image is the bulldog ant of Australia, that, when cut in half, struggles in a battle to the death between its head and tail. Our very quest for scientific and practical knowledge creates, for Schopenhauer, sinfully and repulsively, a world that feasts nightmarishly upon itself. This marks the origin of Schopenhauer's renowned pessimism. He claims that as individuals, we are the anguished products of our own epistemological making, and that within the world of appearances that we structure, we are fated to fight with other individuals, and to want more than we can ever have. On Schopenhauer's view, the world of daily life is essentially violent and frustrating. It is a world that, as long as our consciousness remains at that level where the principle of sufficient reason applies in its fourfold root, will never resolve itself into a condition of greater tranquility. As he explicitly states, daily life is suffering. And to express this, he employs images of frustration taken from classical Greek mythology, such as those of Tantalus and the Danaids, along with the suffering of Ixion on the ever-spinning wheel of fire. The image of Sisyphus expresses the same frustrated spirit.